Welcome to Direct, Meditating on the Way, a show about the Psalms. My name is John Mark Hicks.
And my name is Bobby Valentine, and we invite you to meditate on God's way in the Psalms with us.
Our choice today is Psalm 110. When Bobby and I have been on by ourselves, we're choosing Psalms that make sense in terms of the whole Psalter. And we began with Psalms 1 and 2, which are the introduction to the Psalter. And we have also talked about Psalm 150, which is the end of the Psalter. And so in this episode, we've chosen a psalm that we think says something about kind of the dynamics of the Psalter, about a marker in the Psalter, an important psalm that marks something significant that is happening in the Psalter, or a theme that is important to the whole Psalter. And that's why we've chosen Psalm 110. So, Bobby, can you tell us maybe why is Psalm 110 so significant in terms of its placement and its function in the
Right.
Psalter as a whole?
Yeah. The book of Psalms is, as you will recall from an earlier episode, divided up into five books on the analogy of the law of Moses and meditating on the way. And this book, in its final form, is teaching God's people about ultimately the kingdom of God and living under God's rulership. But you recall in Psalm 2 that God has called his people to meditate on the way, Psalm 1, but he's also installed a co regent, if you will, a king on his throne to rule in his place. And that particular psalm allows us to understand what's going on in the psalm itself. And as you go through book one, two, and three, we see that there is an up and down, mountains and valleys, sometimes wonderful, glorious visions of grace, and also utter destitution in terms of unfaithfulness. And when you get to Psalm 89, which is the conclusion of book three of the Psalms, it tells the story, if you will, of the fall or the disintegration, the failure of the kings of Israel. That and they cry out, "Where, O Lord, is your steadfast love?" Apparently, Jerusalem and including the temple itself, the dynasty of David, it seems to have disappeared. You open up in book four of the Psalms, and you get this psalm by Moses talking about how God is basically eternal, but then it quickly talks about the one true king. The one true king is God. God is the ruler in Psalms 94, 96, and 99, and all that kind of. He is the real king. But then suddenly, you get to Psalm 110 with conscious echoes back to Psalm 89 and Psalm 2. And we see all of a sudden this language, the Lord saying to my Lord, sit at my right hand, clearly going back to God affirming the promises in Psalm 2, affirming in Psalm 89, I have not abandoned you, I'm not haven't abandoned David, I haven't abandoned my people. And God is still king, but we have again a co-regent, if you will, somebody who is ruling on earth in God's place. And so as the psalm comes to an end, the book of Psalms come to an end, it's reminding us not to put our faith, if you will, so much in the human representative of God, but God really is the king, but he will rule ultimately through one who is going to be anointed, one who will uh, execute faithfully, finally on earth, the will of the Lord, which ties back to another psalm, Psalm 72, where we're praying for the Lord's will. The Lord will give to his king his own righteousness, his own justice, and he will rule not so much to bring glory to himself, but on behalf of the widows and the orphans and the aliens and the poor. And so the psalm of this particular book is calling us to have focus on Yahweh, to have faith that God is still keeping his promises to his people that go way, way back in the history of Israel, that right now might seem like a something that has failed. But this particular psalm in this place reminds us that God's faithfulness is still there. Does that make sense, John Mark?
Yes, yes, I think that's right. When we think about the fifth book and the final edition of the Psalter,
Right.
whenever the redactor or the editor put it all together for its use in the temple, typically the book five is thought to be kind of post-exilic kind of psalms. But placed in that, and remember the post-exilic era is there's no king.
No king.
I mean, there's no nation, right? They have not been restored.
Right.
But Psalm 10 then functions as a remembrance of David, goes back to David probably, and it's a remembrance of David in the post exilic era as a response to Psalm 89. When Psalm 89 ends with, okay, where is your promise to David?
Where is your
Well,
promise? Where is it?
Psalm
Well, it's right
110
here.
is the response to that. God
Absolutely.
still intends to keep the promise, that the God is faithful to God's promises. So
That's right.
Psalm 110 is kind of a high water mark, you might say, in how book five begins and
Absolutely.
plays out as a message of hope for Israel as it sings its praises in the temple. So especially in the post-exilic era, there's
That's right.
still going to be a king. The king
That's
is
right.
coming. And so that's
God
why
has
Psalm
not,
110 has
yeah,
these kind of
that's right.
messianic hopes attached to it.
Exactly. God's not done with David yet.
Right. Exactly. God's not
Not
done with
done.
David. So let's,
Yep.
with that background in mind, let's read the psalm. And Bobby, if you want to read it as we walk through Psalm 110.
Will do.
Whoop, there we go.
All righty. And we're going to be reading from the NIV today. So Psalm 110. The Lord, that is Yahweh, says to my Lord, which is Adonai, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The Lord, that is Yahweh, will extend your mighty scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your troops will be willing on your day of battle. Arrayed in holy splendor, your young men will come to you like dew from the morning's womb. The Lord, Yahweh, has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will crush kings on the day of his wrath. He will judge the nations, heaping up the dead and crushing the rulers of the whole earth. He will drink from a brook along the way, and so he will lift his head high.
The word of the Lord. Thanks be to
Amen.
God. Well, I think, Bobby, most people recognize that this psalm has two oracles in it, that it's two direct quotations from God, right? So
Yep.
Yahweh says to Adonai, whether this is a court prophet in the royal court, a court prophet who is saying this about the enthronement of the Israel's king, or
Yep.
whether it's David himself. I think it can be both. I think
It could
it
be.
can function
Could
as
be.
both. But the
Yep.
oracle, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. That's the first oracle in verse
It is.
1. The second oracle is in verse 4. You are a priest forever. In fact, this is not only an oracle, it's an oath. God is
Right.
swearing and
He's
say,
swearing.
I will not change my mind about this. This is the way it's going to be. So
Right.
don't have any doubt about this. Don't let your circumstance create a kind of instability. Don't let it
Yeah.
deflate your faith. Rather,
Right.
recognize that God has promised something here. He's promised a king at his right hand, and he's promised a priest forever. And
That's
they're
right.
the same
But
person.
and the
You,
same.
yeah, the
That's
one who
right.
says, you sit at my right hand, you are a priest forever. So those two
Absolutely.
oracles kind of are the foundation stones, you might say, the platform for
They
this
are.
song.
And those two right there, tying in with what we said before, reaffirm God's commitment to the house of David that they were asking about in Psalm 89. Where's God? Where's your steadfast love? Where's your commitment to the house of David? Well, God has sworn. It's still going on. So the psalm is affirming that these promises still are going on, and God Himself is speaking here. So if this was a red letter edition of the Bible and they put the words of Yahweh in red, those two verses would be in red letters. So it's just
Right, the
kind
two
of
oracles. Yeah.
um,
So it is really
uh,
a strong sense of hope here that
very strong sense of hope.
Israel, no matter what its circumstance, whether it's worshiping
Yeah,
in the time of David or whether it's worshiping in the post exilic era, that this is God's promise that
right.
Israel will have a king that defeats their enemies and they will have a priest
They will
who
have a priest.
mediates for them,
Yep,
intercedes for them uh, between God and the people. So
that's
those
right.
two promises are really core promises for the whole story of Israel.
The whole story of Israel, and as you know, not only the story of Israel, but as God has renewed Israel in the story of the New Testament, those two promises continue to go on in the story of the King of Israel, who is Jesus, and Israel that has been renewed in the church. The church didn't replace Israel, but God renewed it, and He's the king and he is the intercessor. He is the priest for God's people even now. So this is one of the most quoted texts and
It
referred
is
to
the
texts.
most quoted text.
That's right. I think verse one is quoted or referred to at least 14 times,
Yeah,
and
that is
so
the most quoted verse in the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament,
yeah,
verse 1 of Psalm
that's right.
110.
So it you used the word a minute ago. It was a word of hope, and so when the New Testament writers come along, they are clearly latching on to this is the hope. God has not forgotten us, and He has remembered it. And they quote this text uh, to affirm that God has kept His promises. I mean, that for Paul is one of the big things. God, all of God's promises, he says, are yes in Christ Jesus, the King of Jesus. So, what are some of the texts, John Mark, that are
Yeah, I
significant
think
in the New
there's a
Testament?
couple we might want to pay close attention to, like the three gospel stories of Jesus um, in Matthew 22, Mark 12, and Luke 20. I want to come back to that when Jesus
Okay,
himself quotes this text
right,
and uses it as kind of an argument about how to identify the Messiah, right? That the Messiah is really greater than David. The
that's right.
Messiah is the son of David, but is greater than David. How can that be? How can
Yeah,
the son of David be greater than David himself? And
right,
that I want to come back to that later on. But a lot of the text are really references to the right hand, seated at the
right,
right hand of
yeah,
God.
right,
So in the Sanhedrin, when Jesus is on trial, he says, like in Mark 14 and in Luke 22, he says, you're going to see me coming on, I'm going to be exalted to the right hand of glory, right? I'm going to be
right.
there. Or in Acts 2, the one that you killed, God has raised from the dead and has enthroned him at the right
At the right
hand. Or
hand,
Stephen
yes,
sees Jesus at the right hand.
right,
Or in Ephesians and Colossians, that Jesus is seated at the right hand of God. Or Romans 8, seated at the right hand, interceding for us. So you even get a priestly understanding of Jesus at the right hand, not just a
right,
royal understanding, but a priestly understanding
Right.
The fact that he sits there to intercede. And then
Right.
First Peter, he's at the right hand above all the principalities and powers. So the right hand language is the language of enthronement
Yeah.
and power and authority. And this authority is an authority over the whole earth. It's the authority over the whole cosmos.
Right.
He is the head of the whole cosmos, you might say.
Right.
And that all principalities and powers are subjected to him, and they
Yeah.
will be there will be a final realization of that.
Right. It's
Um,
it it's like a language of exaltation.
exactly.
Of because this is an enthronement psalm, and being installed at the right hand, as we're going to come back to, you know, this is God's throne, but he's going to be seated at the right hand of God. That's the highest place you can be on planet Earth, or even in the heavens, the highest place, and all authority has been given to me. He's going to
You know,
say,
Bobby,
which
as I look at these texts, I'm recognizing we're missing one. It's First Corinthians 15,
1 Corinthians 15,
where
right?
he's
Um,
um, where he must
29,
reign until the last enemy is
last
put under
enemies.
his feet. Which
That's right.
First Corinthians 15, what verse 26 or
29.
so, something around there. So
Yeah.
it has that
29.
uh, under the footstool, put
Under the
all the enemies
footstool.
at his footstool. Yeah.
Yep.
So what, I mean, the italicized ones are in Hebrews. Bobby, what are those about in 110 verse 4?
Those are references to the order of Melchizedek that the sermonator, as I call him in the epistle to the Hebrews, or the sermon to the Hebrews, where he is saying that today he has become a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And this is very important to uh, the author for what he can do and is doing right now, as he has been exalted to the right hand of God. Now he is installed in his realm, in his body, as he says, to intercede as the high priest who has shared in all the sufferings and all the whys and wherefores of humanity. But unlike the Davidic kings, he did not fall short. He did not sin. But now he can present himself as the fulfillment, if you will, of the Torah of the Lord. He is righteous, and he has been given an
Yeah.
indestructible life. And there he is. And we look at him, and we know that the king is on our side. And Hebrews makes a really big deal out of this. He is both a priest and the king. He is a priest king, or
Like
he's a king
Melchizedek.
priest. So, um,
So,
representing us.
I
Go ahead.
think, let me just piggyback on you there for a moment. You and I have been very impressed with David Moffat's book, Rethinking Atonement,
Right.
and how he argues the case, which was stated in Hebrews 1, verse 3. After he made purification of sin, he sat down at the
Sat
right
down.
hand of God.
Right.
So his function as priest was to die and rise. And in rising, he offered himself. He enters into the Holy of Holies, the sanctuary of God, and he offers his body. He offers
Right.
himself as the obedient one who fulfilled the Torah, who did the
Well,
Torah, and
exactly.
as offering himself as the high priest before God. Therefore, God highly exalts him. Right? God sits him at the right hand of God. So we have this royal high priest who is functioning like the high priest in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, but he stays in the but this high priest has gone into the heavens and he stays there, and he's
Exactly. Exactly.
there interceding for us. And we're outside, as you've suggested to me many times, we're outside the tabernacle. We're here on earth waiting for him to come out of the heavens again,
That's
as
right.
Hebrews 9:28 says, to
That's
deliver
right.
us, not to bear sin, which is what he did the first time, but
Right.
the
But to
second
bring
time he
salvation.
comes to utterly save us, to
That's right.
save us from the bondage, the enslavement to death.
And and it says in Hebrews that he was called to this, like Aaron was called. This one, and in Psalm 110, he is called to this. And this high priest is something that takes place after the exaltation, after the ascension of Jesus in Hebrews, that's when he goes in there, and then he is
Yeah.
called into this ministry on behalf of the people. He's
Yeah.
other
He
he's the
had to become
king, and now
human.
he is he
He
be,
had to
that's
become
right.
human to be a
So
priest.
that's
And now
right.
becoming
That's right.
human, he's obedient and having obeyed God, he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And having suffered, he became, right? He
He
became our high
became.
priest after
That's right.
having
That's
suffered,
right.
right? Well,
So
those are
yeah,
great.
this is not on Hebrews, but it
Yeah,
is definitely. I think the Hebrew preacher is using Psalm 110, the logic there, to kind of guide his exposition of Jesus's role for where
right.
he is now, number one, and what he is doing right now, and while we are waiting, just like the children of Israel, they're waiting, but we have faith that God is faithful and our King is faithful before Him, and He's merciful. So, I mean, that's the great thing.
Yeah,
Some of the kings of Israel were not very merciful; they were not very just. And what we see in Psalm 110 is that this particular Messiah, this particular anointed one, at the end of the story, when there was no more Zedekiahs, there was no more Isaiahs, there was no failures anymore. There was only one that could possibly come, and that one
yeah.
is empowered by God Himself,
Well, that's
and
what
says,
makes
"Look,
a priestly king, right? He's a
that's right,
priest and king. He can rule for justice, but he can also exercise mercy as priest,
exactly,
right? So he's
that's
both.
right,
He's a both
that's
and.
right, that's right,
And Hebrews makes a big deal of that. As you can see, Hebrews quotes this more than any other New Testament book. So it's
that's right."
central to Hebrews' argument. But
And he
you're right.
quotes
Let's get back to the
both
psalm itself.
oracles.
Go ahead.
So I was just going to say that he quotes both oracles. He
Right. He quotes
quotes
both of them.
both
Right.
1 and 4,
The
and he's the
only
only
the
one
only New
that quotes
Testament
them.
author to quote
Yeah.
both oracles. Right.
Right, right.
So as we think
So,
about, let's take that first oracle again, that he must reign until the enemies sit at my right hand until I make your enemies my footstool or your footstool. Then we have verses 2 and 3, a pretty strong language. I mean, the Lord sends out from Zion your mighty scepter, rule in the midst of your foes. It's kind of this and the language of enemies. I mean, who are
it
these
is.
enemies, right? And this king is going to rule until the enemies are subjugated, until the
Right.
enemies are conquered. What are we talking about there?
Well, I think that number one, that the Lord sends this out from Zion, that is the temple, and the temple is the representative of God's thing up in heaven where
God's
God
heavenly
is.
temple, yeah.
So God's heavenly temple. And so the authority here, the scepter, that's his power, so to speak. The power is coming from God. It's not the king's power. Again, this is a very theocentric psalm. It is Yahweh's power, not the king's power. Yahweh has given it to him. And I think it purposefully, as we said at the beginning of our podcast, tying back to Psalm 2, where the enemies there are gathering together in a evil assembly, if you will, to cast off the rule of God's anointed. And now here in Psalm 110, the Lord has anointed him. The Lord has said, "Sit at my right hand," and you're going to rule in the middle of those enemies. You're going to rule in that world, that fallen world, which is what, even now, if we turn this Christologically, Jesus is doing that. He is reigning, but the world does not recognize his kingdom or his authority. In fact, they mock it, just like they do in Psalm 2. But he says,
Yeah,
"You're going to do this." Go ahead. You're about
yeah,
to say
let's
something?
pursue that a little bit, that Christological, because that was the text that was left out of our chart, 1 Corinthians 15, that he
Mm-hmm.
must reign until he has
Until
put every enemy, under. And what's the last enemy? It's
is
death.
death.
So this
That's
is
right.
kind of eschatological. When we're looking at Psalm 110, we're looking and its origins, talking about how Israel is going to exist among the nations. Right?
right,
And when we look at the Christological application here, it's Jesus at the right hand of the Father over not just living among the nations, but it's exaltation over all the principalities and powers and
right.
authorities and rulers. It's a global kind of cosmic thing that includes not just the realities we can see, but the realities we don't see.
The
And
realities we don't see.
ultimately, it's an eschatological thing in the sense that Christ is going to rule over this broken world and its messed up rulers and it's messed up politics and it's messed up injustices. He's going to rule over it until he conquers that last enemy when he releases us from the enslavement to death by the
That's right.
resurrection. So
That's right.
that's kind of it begins with Israel as kind of a type of or symbol of the fuller reality that we
Right.
find in Christ.
That's right. So, yeah, in ancient Israel, depending on when this, we mentioned David, this goes all the way back there, where David does rule among all the enemies. But every Israelite king, whether you're talking about northern Israel, southern Israel, Judah, that was the same reality. They were surrounded by enemies, and God is empowering them, hoping against hope. If we can speak of Yahweh having hope, that finally this one will be the righteous king, like Psalm 72. But that doesn't happen until Jesus comes. So, but it does. Do you have anything else you want to say about
Well,
verse
there are a couple
two?
of things like in verse 3, this
Oh,
willing
well, verse
army.
three. Yeah.
You know,
So,
there's
yeah,
willing
yeah,
army that.
yeah.
Oh, was that where you wanted to go?
Well, I was going to move on to verse
Okay,
three, but I didn't know if we were
well,
done
yeah.
with verse
Think
two.
about verse 3
So,
for a moment. The womb of the morning, the kind of a birthing. There's a birthing of joy. There's and the
yeah,
holy mountains. So I think when we, some of the early church writers looked at verse 3 and talked about the begetting of the Son from eternity, uh, created, not created, but begotten. And
yeah,
Jesus uses this kind sort of exegesis of the psalm in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, like in
right,
Mark 12 where he says at the end of this, all this contentious controversy, all these questions, the people, the Pharisees and scribes and lawyers are asking him, and finally Jesus says, "Okay, you done? Let me ask you a question."
right,
And he asks a question, okay, how can the Messiah, which you think Psalm 110 is referring to, how can the Messiah, who is a son of David, be greater than David?
right,
Because David is saying, Yahweh said to my Lord. David is saying, that's my Lord.
right, right,
So who's Lord over David? Who is that? And
right.
of course, Jesus is making the point that the Messiah is not just a son of David, right?
That's right.
The Messiah is more than a son of David. It
He's the
includes
Lord of
being a
David.
son of David. He is a
That's
son of
right.
David, but more
Yeah,
than a son of David. And the
that's right.
messianic role
Right.
is greater. And I think, in his book, Matthew Bates, called The Birth of the Trinity,
Yeah,
really does a really good job of unpacking how this assumption of the Lord speaking to the Lord and David recognizing both are greater than him has reflects a kind of dialogue between the Father and the Son
right.
from the beginning,
Yeah,
and becomes and is realized in the incarnation, and becomes concretized in the obedience and death and resurrection of Jesus. So I would commend, if you want to look more closely at that, our listeners, Matthew Bates' book, Birth of the Trinity, which he does a really
right.
good job of that.
And
So you
that's
want to
looking
move
at
on to verse 4?
exegesis of the early church.
Okay,
Oh, yeah. So,
go
well,
ahead.
before we do that, I want to say one thing because to
Okay,
me it's of interest.
sure.
So the word translated dew can be translated as rain, but that's my daughter's name, Talia.
No, okay. Very good. Very good.
So I just want everybody to know that. So that's a cool word. So I love that word. But yeah, verse 4 is an interesting one because this is where Yahweh takes an oath. He swears, and as the Hebrew writer, he says, how can God take an oath? he just swears by himself. I mean, there's nothing greater than God. He can't lie, and so he just all right. But it's unusual for God to take an oath, and I think one reason that the writers placed this text here in Book 5 of the Psalter is precisely because of that, because the Davidic dynasty is in ashes. Are we done? It's kind of like the chronicler asking the question, will God, does he still love us? Will he take us back? Well, Psalm 110 says, yes, God is not done with us. He has taken an oath and he will not change his mind. That's pretty strong
Yeah.
language. He
And
will not
the fact that he's a
change his mind.
priest, you're a priest, means the temple is going to keep going somehow.
The temple's going to keep
Yeah,
going.
even
That's
if it's
right.
been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again, it's
So
going to be. It's the priesthood continues.
that's right. The ministry of the priests are not done. They're not gone. They are taken up. You, the king of Israel, will be my priest after the order of Melchizedek. But not only will that be the case, it will be forever.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like that guarantees this kind of language here because it is the king, and this is what's the surprising thing here. If this is an enthronement, that which I believe that it is, it's not surprising to anybody that the king is named the king and he is somehow brought into a relationship with the deity in the ancient world. The surprising thing in Israel, anyway, is that the king is also identified with the unique role that he is the priest. He's a
Right.
priest king,
Yeah, but he's
which
not a priest in the Levitical order. All right.
that's right.
He's not a priest in Levitical. He can't do the Levitical rites.
Right.
But we see the kings leading worship at times, like Solomon at
We
the
do.
temple or David bringing in the Ark of the Covenant. So Israel's kings functioned as priests,
They
not
did.
Levitical priests,
Not
but
Levitical priest.
priest, and in this case, priest after the order of Melchizedek. Right? They were
That's right.
by their vocation as king, they were also given the vocation of a priestly function
Right.
to serve as the king priest in Israel, not by genealogy.
No.
It's not by I'm a part of an inherited line here, but
Yeah.
by the oath of God, by the swearing of oath, which is exactly why Jesus could be a priest, even though he wasn't a tribe of Levi. He
That's
wasn't a
right.
priest according to Levitical order. He was a priest according to the royal priesthood order, which is the
That's
order
right.
of David and Solomon and Melchizedek. And as you
That's right.
said in the ancient Near East, very common for kings to also be priests.
That's right. So, and it is a very common thing. And it seems that that was the case in Israel, even though the Hebrew Bible doesn't talk about it very much. But this union of the priestly role and the kingly role um, puts the king himself, something about the king, that person, in a unique relationship to both God and to the people.
Mm-hmm.
He is, in some sense, um, an embodiment of the people. What is good for the king is good for the people, and what is bad for the king is bad for the people. When he sins, things go bad. I mean, when he's righteous, all things are going good. At the same time, he has some kind of he's not doing Day of Atonement sacrifices, but he does lead the people of God before the throne of God in worship. The books of Samuel even say that David was wearing the linen ephod. I mean that
Right.
is a usually a
Dressed
high
like a
priestly
priest.
thing.
Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
so we see that, and you already mentioned Solomon. Solomon, it even says that he did sacrifices. I mean that is uh,
Right.
we can
Second
argue whether
Chronicles.
that's
Yeah.
literal or not, but that's what it says. So there's something there that all of Israel's hopes and dreams, if you want to call them that, come to focus on this person, and he represents them. And when God doesn't keep his promise to the house of David, that means Israel itself is gone. But if God honors his promises to the house of David, then the order of Melchizedek is forever, but that also means that the people of God are forever. That this is something to really, really hold on to in the days of you think of maybe when the Seleucids come along, and they're just it's really a bad and miserable time, which the Hebrew writer also makes much of in Hebrews 11.
Yeah.
That the world was not even worthy of them because they wouldn't give up. But they didn't have a king then either. So, but I could go on in all kinds of directions
Yeah.
on that.
So
But
I
I'll
think,
let
when you think about Psalm 110, then what I hear you saying is this the function of king with authority and the function of priest with mercy and mediation and intercession. This is the hope of Israel,
it is the
that
hope of
that
Israel.
that God will act in such a way as to execute justice in the world through the king, and redeem and reconcile the world as well through the priest, through this
That's
one
right.
person. So
That's right.
Psalm 110 functions as this psalm of hope that Israel can look to and say, this is why we expect a Messiah. This is why we expect an anointed to arise, because God is going to keep his promise to David, and
That's
God
right.
will do this again.
Right. And yeah, just building off that in the very next verse, in verse 5, notice how in the way up there in verse 1, the king, he says, sit at my right hand. That's Yahweh speaking to the new king, sit at mine. But when you get down to verse 5, it says the Lord is at your right hand.
Right.
And this, I
Mm-hmm.
think, is referring to uh, this is not the right word, but God is with you, kind of thing. It's God wherever you go, I will be there in your midst, kind of thing. Oh, I want to use the
Mm-hmm.
word indwelling, but that's not the right word that I want to use here. But that's the idea
Right.
that He is. I'm not going to leave you, forsake you. You can't get rid of me, kind of thing. But the Lord is at your right hand, and then the language is indeed not the king. Again, this is a theocentric psalm. He,
Yeah. It's
not
the
the
Lord. Yeah.
king,
Yeah. Adonai
will
here will.
execute justice, which takes again, this refers back to Psalm 2. He's in heaven and he laughs in derision at the enemies who are scoffing at his king, his anointed one, as he calls him in Psalm 2. And that's what he's doing here. He's like, okay, you've made war on our people, my king, my priest, and now this is going to be your fate. They will not stand in the day of judgment, is what it says in Psalm 2. But now, the, the judgment of the nations. Now, this can go in a lot of different directions, too. I mean, we come to this and we hear certain things which may or may not be very accurate on what I think it means. The day of wrath, for example, we talked about that in one of our other episodes. This is not some emotional explosion by Yahweh. Oftentimes when God comes in judgment, like in Psalm 99 or in Isaiah chapter 11, when God comes in judgment, it is actually the elimination of evil. And in Isaiah 11, it's the destruction of the weapons of war. They're going to be thrown into the fire and be done with. And so when God executes justice here or judgment, it's going to ultimately result in, as God defends the reign of God, as God defends his kingdom, it results in shalom. Now, that I think is where it goes.
Yeah. But I think you can
So,
see that in verse 7, as I understand
yeah,
verse 7. I don't know how you take verse 7, but he will drink from the stream by the path, therefore he will lift up his head. Whether that's talking about Yahweh or is that talking about the king?
yeah,
I think people read it both ways, but whatever
yeah,
it is, it represents this kind of shalom moment. Hey,
yeah,
you can stop and get a drink by the
right,
stream, and you can lift up your head, and you can enjoy life, and you can flourish, you might say. going back
Yeah.
to Psalm 1, in that
Someone, I was just
context.
about to say that.
Right.
Like a
So,
tree planted by
yeah,
the
by the stream.
that's
Exactly.
right.
So
Um,
the judgment brings peace. So
yeah,
when I think about verses 5 and 6, I think what comes to my mind Christologically is Revelation 19, when Jesus comes out of the heavens, right, and judges the nations and
he judges
judges
it. Yeah,
Babylon, particularly for
yeah,
what Babylon has done, for what the empire has done, for what the nations have done, the principalities and powers have done to the people of God and to the
that's
earth
right.
itself.
And to the
As
earth
the
itself,
Yeah,
those who make war on the world, and you read chapter 17 and 18, you realize that the beast has been very, very much a beast against the poor in
yeah.
the book
Well,
of
the
Revelation.
merchandising of chapter
So,
18,
yeah,
where the wealth belongs
um,
to Rome, right?
that's right.
And
And
they're greedy and they're exploitive, and people are just about making money, and it
um,
therefore exploits the poor for sure.
well, those who support the beast, absolutely.
Exactly.
Which is the other kings, I mean, so I think you're exactly right that the New Testament is not afraid of this language. It is well aware of the enemies under the footstool. Hebrews alludes to that several times. But the New Testament, as you just said in the book of Revelation or other places, that
Yeah. Second
the
Thessalonians
enemies
1.
will be
Yeah.
defeated. Um, Jesus will reign supreme. And as I was mentioning a little while ago, I think that's really what Matthew 28 says in verse 20, that he's going to go out and he's going to proclaim his kingship to the world. The king of Israel has arrived, and now the nations belong to him. And so the disciples are commissioned to be his ambassadors, to be his emissaries to the nations and say, look, God's anointed one has come. He has defeated death. Now come pledge allegiance to the king.
Right.
And I think that's what's going on in Matthew 28, verse 20, is actually, all the nations are going to be blessed, of course, but that blessing again is somehow a function of God's judgment on them. And I go
Justice.
back
Right.
to those Psalms in Book 4, like Psalm 99. The nations are actually praising the Lord. Um, it says, "Mighty King, lover of justice, have you established equity? Have you executed justice? Exalt the Lord and worship Him at His footstool. Holy is He." Because they're all going to experience a salvation moment. The world is being put to right
Right.
by justice. We read that word, and so many times we think of that as penal. Now, the enemies of God, those who are actually the enemies of God, will be dealt with. But those who are suffering because of the enemies of God, their world is being put back to right. That's what the
And they're
king
going to
is
be
supposed to
released. Yes. So, and I
do.
mean, in Revelation 22, you have the nations are still there, right? The
The
nations are
nations,
present,
and they're
and they're
bringing
being
their
healed with the
treasures.
tree of life and that sort of thing.
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely.
yeah. So I think what I'm hearing from you and what I'm getting uh, in terms of these two oracles, they functioned as hopeful sayings of God, prophetic words from God. Israel, take confidence. The Lord Yahweh says to Adonai, sit at my right hand. Yahweh swears to Adonai, you will be a priest. And
Right.
those two hopeful statements sustain Israel's faith. And that's kind of how Hebrews uses it too, right? To sustain the faith of the people that are struggling. And we sit in the same spot
We do.
because our king is not visible to us
That's
at
right.
this moment. And
But
yet we believe that he will return. And we're
we do.
waiting with
We
for
are
the
waiting.
hope when that last enemy will be destroyed and our priest will emerge out of the heavens and
That's right.
return to the earth, and we will celebrate a new earth filled with justice and peace, and a new
Right.
earth where God dwells with his people as God did in the tabernacle. And Psalm 110 then still functions for the people of God as a psalm of
Exactly.
hope and confidence.
Well, that's exactly what the Sermonator says in Hebrews. He says he's gone
Exactly.
into that room, that sanctuary, and that he is seated at God's right hand, and he is waiting, as we are waiting, he is waiting until God places all things, those the enemies under his his feet. And
Well,
so
that's a great place for us to stop, I think. We've
absolutely.
kind of
Yeah.
run through Psalm 110. Hopefully it's been helpful for those who have listened, and thank you for being here. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Be blessed.
Be blessed.